Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending this session today, for being the first. My name is Amy. I am the Customer Success Manager at Pressbooks. I think and talk a lot about OER, open pedagogy, equitable learning, and all of its parts and the way that it can really support any student and learner out there. It's a real privilege for me to host this panel today with our three amazing guests. So being the first to do anything has its challenges. Being the first to introduce OER at a campus is a big challenge. Being the first to introduce OER by creating or heavily adapting OER is a massive challenge, but it's one to which many brave and courageous faculty have risen. We can learn a lot from their experiences and apply that knowledge to make the leap to creating OER for the first time less terrifying. These panelists we have here today are all champions and leaders of open, all using the principles of something that one of our panelists, Farhad, quoted in his paper: a ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. This panel truly embodies the theme of the conference, building bridges to open up education. So today we'll be having a conversation with our panelists about their experiences and expertise on OER, and more importantly, being the first at it. If you have any questions, as Kelly had mentioned, please save them for the end of the session. I will be saving about 10 to 15 minutes so that if any of you have questions that you'd like to ask directly to our panelists, you will have the opportunity to ask them then. If you have any questions that are relevant to the questions that I have asked, please feel free to leave them in the chat and I'll make sure that they get tucked in between the predetermined questions. So that's all the rules that I have. I want this to be a fun, casual conversation where it can be an exchange of knowledge between our panelists and our attendees. Without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists. Firstly is Becca Cibrian. Becca is a German lecturer in the World Languages Department at Boise State. While participating in the OPAL Fellowship, sponsored by the Idaho State Board of Education, she and a colleague produced a distinctive grammar addition to accompany Deutsch im Blick, not a German speaker, a previously existing OER textbook for German language learners. She also earned a top state honor as the 2019 World Language Teacher of the Year. Becca, I will now let you have the opportunity to present yourself.
Good morning, everybody. First, I'm saying good morning because it's 10 o'clock where I'm at. And I just want to acknowledge that Boise State and where I live is traditionally the traditional homeland of the Shoshone-Paiute Nation. And I feel like I am in really esteemed company here because I didn't create something brand new. I adapted and remixed a traditional or an OER text, and I just want to explain that. I've been really interested in OER for a long time, and I'm really excited to be able to work with open pedagogy and create my own text to share with my students and my colleagues.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Becca. Next is Ariana Santiago. Ariana is the Open Educational Resources Coordinator at the University of Houston. She is a well-known leader and librarian in the OER world and has spent several years supporting faculty and raising OER awareness on campus. She's been an OE Leadership Fellow and produced a report entitled Enhancing OER Support by Developing a Workflow and Service Model, which I actually have read and it was so great to read, to better lead and support a growing OER program at University of Houston. You can present yourself, Ariana.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you all. I'm really excited for the panel. I'll add a little bit more context to my role. I'm a librarian at the University of Houston. I'm the OER coordinator, so I lead our program here, and I also manage our incentive program. And since this panel is focused on adapting and creating OER and being the first to do so, I want to mention that we don't necessarily have an OER publishing program where we act as the publisher. It's more of an author DIY model. And I got that term from the Open Education Network, where we provide consultations, some funding, as well as a platform to publish. So I'm really focused more on supporting faculty members and instructors who are adapting and creating, but it's not a full publishing program. So I just wanted to make that clear up front so you have that bit of context. And I'm really excited for the panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ariana. And lastly is Farhad Dastoor, Dr. D, as his students call him. Farhad is a cognitive scientist and a faculty member of Kwantlen Polytechnic University's psychology department in Surrey, British Columbia. In addition to teaching a plethora of psych classes spanning over the past 2 decades, he has advocated for OER and opening up collegial departments. He authored a paper entitled How to Open an Academic Department, which was published in 2017, which is an amazing paper, and it has been circulated in my team, and has been an OE Research Fellow. Farhad.
Thank you, Amy, for that beautiful introduction. And I'm really excited to be part of the Michigan OER conference. One of the joys of being an academic is going to conferences. And I would have really been thrilled to come to Michigan, to the beautiful state, and meet like-minded colleagues and sample the local foods and really experience the culture of Michigan. So I'm sorry that can't happen. But it is an exciting day, and to the conference organizers, I'm really thankful for you acknowledging the value of openness in all its dimensions, and I'm excited to participate with my panelists, Becca and Ariana, and have Amy moderate. I'm in Vancouver on the West Coast of Canada. I teach at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. We are honored to be on the Indigenous territories of several First Nations, including the Kwantlen, the Katzie, the Kikite, the Coquitlam peoples, the Tsawatsin, and the Semiahmoo. And we are committed to working with those peoples with honor and respect. I think we have a lot of questions today, so I'm not going to do more of an introduction than Amy already provided, but just to say I'm very excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. D. I think that as the panelists have introduced themselves, you can really have a feel for how different their roles are. And I hope that the variety in roles that they're representing here is reflective of all of you attendees today. And I hope that you will be able to learn a lot from our panelists. So without further ado, I'll jump into the questions. So my first question is that everyone has their own story about how they became interested in open education and a story of why they stayed engaged. Sometimes the pull began with wanting to reduce financial barriers to education. Sometimes it flowed from a teacher's desire to personalize and adapt materials for their students as individuals. And sometimes it's rooted in the joy of co-creating knowledge or building with others, and with a commitment to equity, inclusion, and access. Can you tell me about what or who initially drew you into open education and who keeps you there? Let's start with Becca.
Well, like I said, thank you, Amy. Like I said in my introduction, I've been thinking about OER, creating my own text for my German classroom for a really long time, but had no idea where to start. So what really drew me in was I received a fellowship from the State Board of Education, and through this fellowship, I learned, step by step how to create something and what that meant. And it was an exciting process because I had no idea where I was going. I just knew what I wanted to have. And because of that fellowship, that was what really drew me in. And that was in spring of last year. So 2020, January. So it's a new process for that. Also within our department, our world languages department at Boise State University, we have a repository of OER, student created OER for world language classrooms. Our state is very rural, and you might, if you were a language teacher at a high school or a middle school here in Idaho, you might be the only language teacher at that high school. So that's something that keeps me there, is this repository and being able to connect with language educators throughout our state. And then ultimately, who really keeps me there now, and it's kind of the next step, is my students. I mean, I want to create more materials with my students, and the advocacy of it. Like, I really, really think it's important to advocate, and so that's kind of what keeps me motivated, is my students and the part of telling people what OER is and open pedagogy, and that's what keeps me motivated.
Awesome. Yeah, I love hearing that. Truly, such an educator, and what a beautiful response. Farhad, I'll pass it off to you because I know you've also taught so many classes and have provided the opportunity for students to have access to these accessible textbooks directly as a faculty member. So pass it off to you.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Really, my journey began 7 years ago in the very room that I'm in right now, which is my living room in my home. And we began with, and apologies to Rebecca, with a coffee klatsch, which is this wonderful German concept of getting together and over coffee and good pastry and having a deep conversation. My department is a very functional department. That might seem a strange thing to say, but it's not always the case at many universities. We would have our departmental meetings, and then afterwards we would have a teaching excellence meeting. And very often it would be at a faculty member's home. And so I invited people to my home. And one of my colleagues, Rajiv Jangiani, who's a well-known figure in the open education movement, proposed the topic that the department wraps its head around using open textbooks, with no agenda or goals or timelines, but just to begin the conversation. So we sat here and we talked about, what does openness mean? What would it mean in terms of our relationship to the commercial textbook providers, because we use a single textbook and we guarantee that we will commit to it for 5 years, and it's taught widely across the campus. It's a big deal. It's $1 million contract, and it comes with all kinds of ancillaries. And so the department was skeptical, but we had at least the seeds planted as to what openness was and what it could potentially do. And from that beginning, a small subcommittee was struck to look into this and how could we integrate it, perhaps on the edges. We have a provincial organization called BC Campus, which does fantastic work on this theme, and they supported us to have a retreat and to develop some multiple choice questions using open formats that could then be used by any of our colleagues across the province. And so bit by bit, I and some of my colleagues got deeper into this field. I might use a different metaphor, actually, maybe a Canadian metaphor, of paddling a canoe. And we put the canoe in the water, and we started to paddle, but not everyone was paddling in the same direction or in unison. And if you've ever been in a canoe, you can lift your paddle out the water and let others do the work and kind of see, enjoy the scenery. And so, the department has come a long way. I've come a long way. And I suppose, today it'll be some reflections on that journey. But it started with something as simple as having great coffee and pastry in a living room with your colleagues and just having a very low stakes conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And lastly, Ariana, I'm interested to hear your response because I feel like librarians are the hidden heroes of every educational institution. And, you've started so many projects at University of Houston, obviously the big one being the textbook incentive program. So I want to hear your response to this as well.
Okay, so yeah, I became involved in open education in 2018 when I started in my current role as OER coordinator here. And really how I became interested in open at all was kind of just by the nature of being presented with the opportunity to take on this new job. So I don't know if that's kind of an unconventional road to open. And for a little more background on that, I was already at UH in a different librarian position. And as our institution was starting to invest in open, part of what they did was created this new position that I'm currently in. And I was offered the opportunity to make an internal move into this role. So kind of interesting thing to me is that I really didn't know very much about OER at that time. And they hired me, I think, based on my proven skills in leadership and communication and my background as an instruction librarian, which I think ties really well into open education, with the understanding that I could then learn everything else that I needed to know, right? Like the content and subject matter of what OER is, copyright, open licensing, all of those specifics can be learned. So I was kind of starting at zero in terms of my background in OER specifically, and a blank a blank slate coming into OER work. And because I wasn't very familiar with OER before being presented with that opportunity, a big part of the initial draw into open education for me was that I was in the place of needing an opportunity for career growth, to be completely honest, and making that shift and trying something new just made sense for me at that time. But there's a lot that keeps me here, right? This was several years ago. I tried something new, and that's a lot of what I really enjoy about it now is that there is so much to learn. Open is evolving and growing and advancing. So it's really exciting, and it's also challenging in a good way. And I also really enjoy the problem solving nature of it and using that to help people reach their goals. So what that means for me is that any faculty member I end up working with, there's something for them that just isn't working, right? It may be that their textbook is really unaffordable, so students aren't able to buy and use it, or it may be something about the content of the available textbooks in their field that just isn't working or supporting student learning in the way that they want it to. And OER is a great potential solution for that. And I get to help them figure that out and get to a point where they're able to do what they want to in their teaching. And of course, all of that is to support student learning and student success, especially for our students at the University of Houston, many of whom are first-generation college students working while they're in school to support themselves and their family, and many who are traditionally underrepresented in higher education. That's kind of my background and story of how I got interested in open, as well as what keeps me here.
I love these differences in responses, you know, whether or not you decided to step into it for professional reasons, or having this seed of an idea that you want to plant into your friends and colleagues' heads, so you know, bring them over for coffee. These are really excellent, different, diverse ways that you can get involved and sort of plant the initial seed for growth. And it's so wonderful to hear of that. So the idea of creating something as massive as a whole textbook alone can be so daunting that it stops many of us before we even begin. I see this a lot in my day-to-day job in supporting faculty and librarians and creating projects and starting projects for their classes. However, open licenses explicitly encourages us to remix, adopt, revise, and adapt materials to make new works. And I'm wondering if our panelists can tell us about finding open content that you wanted to adapt or adopt, and your experiences revising these open resources. How did this work compare to what you would have done if you were starting from scratch? And was there anything that surprised you about revising and remixing? And I'll start with Becca, because you're such an explicit example of this.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm really lucky in my discipline because there are a lot of open resources, open educational resources for us in languages. I started working with an open textbook just because I liked the availability of it, and it was free for students. And I felt like I just needed like a framework and vocabulary lists that they had. So I was using a textbook that is housed at the Center for Open Educational Resources in Language Learning at the University of Texas, Austin. And so I felt like I had an easy in, right, to find the open resources already. So when I first started working in the fellowship, I'm like, what? I can just change what I want. Like I didn't understand that, right? And the text that I was working with had an open license, and I could remix it however I wanted, however we wanted. My colleague and I that worked on this project together. So I feel like I have an easy way to find the information. As far as like creating from scratch, that's kind of for me possibly the next step, you know, maybe in the next couple of years, is that I created a grammar to accompany this open textbook. But I'm working with open materials already that are available for me to remix however I would like to. And I'll put in the chat that center for if there's any language teachers here, that if you're not familiar with it already, if you're interested in open, then you already know about this language learning or this language learning center. But I felt like it was easy for me because my department was already working with open resources, and I already had information readily available and textbooks readily available that I could just, you know, remix however I wanted to. So I'm maybe not the best person to answer this because like I said, world languages, I feel like we're already kind of leading in that area.
Awesome. And what about you, Farhad, especially with regards to that initial textbook, that sort of, you had to convince your the board to let you use, other than, besides the $1 million contract.
Right. Before I answer that question, let me just say that I think one of the things that is very important in moving the needle in terms of adoption at an institution is that the genesis for the movement needs to start in the right place. And what I mean by that is it starts with, the faculty who want to experiment and be courageous, as you had pointed out in your introduction, what are sometimes called the innovators. And they tend to move ahead without any permission, and they lead and they get results, good and bad. But then there comes a problem because they're working at the margins and they're usually not supported. And they might even be told to shut down or stand down. So they have to convince the next group, which are often called the early adopters in the diffusion of adoption models. And those people are willing to try innovations or a new practice, but they need a little bit more structure and a little bit more resource help. That's where people like librarians come in, and that's when you need to start building coalitions. In the open movement, the coalitions would be students, would be librarians, would be like-minded administrators, and then you move outwards to the state, the provincial, the national, international organizations. So what we did was the subcommittee that we had struck, that I spoke about, that looked into openness at the department level. So it's owned by the department. It's not coming from an edict from the vice president's office. Suggested to the department that we allow faculty to use an open textbook for introduction to psychology. We're free to use whatever textbook for any other psychology course, but we weren't for the intro course because it was such a big deal. And there was a resolution and a motion, and the motion passed, and with the caveat that the people who were using the open textbook would report back to the department as to what were their experiences like, the grades, the student responses, etc. So that motion allowed the early adopters to start to go deeper and explore different, parts of the river. And that's what I did. I used the NOVA textbook, which was designed by Ed Diner, who's a famous psychologist, and his colleagues. And Ed Diner's approach was to build modules for every one of the chapters that you would find in any introduction to psychology textbook. And I apologize for keep using psychology as your example, but just, insert your discipline, right? And he approached the leading scholars in the field in that area. So the chapter on memory was written by one of the acknowledged international leaders on memory. So that answered the criticism that OER can't be good quality because, after all, it's free. OER can't be good quality because we've never heard of it. OER can't be good quality because it's not going through the regular publishing system that we all grew up with and understand. And then you say, well, do you respect these people? And they're like, yes, of course, these are the leading lights in our field. Well, they've just written a module in OER, using OER on this topic, right? And that silences people, I found. So that's so I have permission to use it because it was a decision made at the departmental level. I used a quality OER, and then we started getting the feedback, which I can talk about later.
Awesome. And Ariana, how do you feel about this from the perspective of someone who supports faculty in revising and remixing content and creating their own content as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm often, I'm not a faculty member adapting or creating my own open textbook or OER to use in a course, right? I'm supporting the people who are doing that. But I have found it really important and a valuable experience to do that myself, even on kind of a smaller scale, to really understand what that process is like. And I had I guess, an opportunity that made sense to do that with. About a year ago, I really was wanting a sort of comprehensive introduction to OER that I could direct faculty towards. And there are a ton of resources out there that I could use for that. So I really did not need to start from scratch and create, something completely on my own. So I did end up adapting the OER starter kit by Abby Elder. And I'll put
that book.
Yeah, it's so great, right? And she had just come out with that recently. And I thought, okay, I can adapt that. And I'll put the link to my adaptation of it. Yeah, that's the right link. So my idea around this was that I would customize it a little bit more for the UH context, right? So just removing the Iowa State examples, making it more Houston specific where I could. And I wanted to incorporate some of the hands-on activities that came from the OER Starter Kit workbook, which was later developed to accompany the starter kit, but I wanted to kind of selectively pull those in. So basically I went through this process, and what I saw as kind of a small scale adaptation was very time consuming still, right? So it was just kind of building that understanding of what this process really is when I'm working with faculty members. And of course, I know it takes a lot of time and effort, but it's one thing to know that, and then another thing to do it. What I found kind of interesting was that at the end of this project, I don't think I actually changed as much as I originally thought I would. I kind of put left some things on the table to come back to later, and focused on just kind of a high priority adaptation. So I think I'll be revisiting that soon. And I can totally imagine this, my adaptation of the original OER starter kit, I can really see it continuing to evolve as maybe our needs evolve, or as I, think of other things that maybe I could have done better. Maybe I'm going to look back at this and say, why did I do that a certain way? So it's also kind of representing that continual nature of OER, where they can be constantly evolving in a really good way.
Yeah.
And there was something else I wanted to mention, just in terms of working with a faculty member who has done this as well. So I had a faculty member who I would definitely call one of those early adopters, or really eager people that's going to just go forward with the thing. But we also want them to have the support. So she adapted, I think, multiple resources and pulled them together for a high enrollment business course. And this is a really cool example for me, because she had previously been using data sets provided by the publisher, along with the publisher provided textbook, and just really wasn't satisfied with that. And they were limiting. And I think the data sets were just too small for the number of students and activities. She needed more robust data sets. So we ended up using public domain government data. Sorry, I was looking for the term, right? And so this is just a really great example to me of pulling from multiple resources, incorporating real world data. And I helped her with identifying resources, really checking over the copyright and Creative Commons licensing to make sure that was good. We got her on Pressbooks. So I put the link to that book in the chat as well.
Awesome. Yeah, another really wide range of responses. You can see that there's projects that are, still in the works. The faculty who, started a project and are now looking forward to the next step, which is to start their own project from scratch. And it is such a blended way of doing things, and how projects never end. And by opening your projects, there's more possibility for a future for this work, and possible future iterations that can go in so many different directions. So I appreciate you guys talking from everything from, supporting faculty, to starting your own projects, to the barriers associated with remixing and revising. This sort of segues well into my next question, and hopefully, Farhad, you can touch on what happened after the students reported back about their experiences with the new accessible textbook. And my question is, were you initially skeptical of OER? And based on your experiences, what would you say to faculty or instructors who are skeptical about OER? And we'll start with Rod.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I was skeptical. It's the nature of academics to be skeptical. We're taught critical thinking. We teach critical thinking to our students. And I had this, the same sort of biases, I think, and reservations as many people. On the other hand, I have I'm going to use some psychology here, but there's a psychological trait called openness to experience. And it means that some people are just more willing to try new things. You know, you go to a new culture and you want to try the new food, that kind of thing. And other people tend to be more conservative, small c conservative. My skepticism was tempered by my curiosity. And because I'm a researcher as well, I had the tools to think more, systematically about the student responses. So, we were getting sort of informal responses that, yes, we love this, and we really enjoy the fact that we don't have to pay, of course. And, the average textbook is costing between $100 and $200. And then even the e-textbooks, the commercial e-textbooks, you don't have access to beyond a certain time period. So I approached some of my colleagues in my department and I said, why don't we do an experiment and definitively convince our colleagues, it was really just for our colleagues in our department, that the open textbook that we're using is just as good as the one that we've always been using, the commercial one. That idea then morphed into a proper study where we had to get permission from our institutional review board, research ethics board. We got some funding, we put together a research team, and that eventually led to a paper published in the Canadian Journal for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And I think the title was something like "Open Textbooks are as good as or better than commercial textbooks." I can put the DOI in the chat for everyone. But what we did was we compared in different sections of the same course in the same semester, students who had been given the commercial textbook versus an open textbook. We also looked at digital format versus print format. And we looked at student perceptions, usage patterns, and course performance. So it's not a true experiment because students didn't decide, they weren't randomized necessarily to which group they were in. And there were some instructor differences, but putting that aside, it was not a bad study in the sense that a lot of other things were controlled for. And what we found was that students assigned the open textbook in either format performed no differently or better than those assigned the commercial textbook. And these results are consistent with the existing literature, at least at the time. The study was published in 2018, supporting the conclusion that the cost savings to students associated with the adoption of open textbooks do not come at the expense of resource quality or student performance. And qualitatively, what the students said to us was, we prefer the open textbook, and this was a little paradoxical for us, because it's simpler than the commercial textbook. Now, as an academic, when I looked at the commercial textbook and compared it to the open one, and we were using the OpenStax textbook at the time, I felt that the commercial textbook was better. It was more authoritative, it had more ancillary support, it went deeper into the topics. And I felt like, okay, but the open textbook maybe over time will rise to that level. But interestingly, at least for intro students, they preferred the clarity and the simplicity of the open textbook without all of the extra detail that we as academics want to see in there. And they gave it higher ratings for that. They said, we can understand this better. So that was interesting feedback. And then that means that, I have to make sure that they're still getting the same content at the same level of nuance and so on. But these are intro students, and we have to remember we're just introducing the topic to them. In second, third, and fourth year, that it might be different. So, we've looked at student feedback in other ways, in surveys and focus groups, and just informal support through teaching evaluations that we do. And the results are consistent. And I would also say that 99% of all my students prefer the digital format of the text, of the open text, to the print version, because that's an option. They can get the print, but they don't like it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really great to hear. And now I want to ask Becca about her experiences in your skepticism of OER, and based on your experiences, what you would say, because you also teach a very, I'm sure, like a big class, and I'm sure it's also digital with all the activities that you're sort of incorporating in there as well.
My classes are somewhat smaller, but
somewhat smaller.
but I mean, I guess I'm a naturally skeptic of things, and I like how Farhad said it. You know, it was tempered by curiosity. But I mean, I've been talking about, you know, creating a text for my German classes for, you know, going on 15 years. So there had to have been some skepticism in there, otherwise I would have done it already. And how would I kind of you know, I don't meet very many skeptics in the OER world right now that I'm in. I don't know if it's because it's the new thing. I have met some skeptics, students that are skeptic with text. The text that I use, the OER text that I use is not traditional in the way that it's not a press book, it's a website. My grammar that I've created is a book, a traditional ebook. So there have been some folks that are skeptic about that, but I guess by the end of the semester, you know, their learning has turned them into a non-skeptic with that. But as far as colleagues and folks around my campus right now, I don't meet very many skeptics, so I guess I'm lucky with that.
I know Boise State has done a lot of amazing work, and it's so great to see that there's not that many skeptics, because there's faculty such as yourself who are, you know, putting the work out there, and that people are really benefiting from. So I'm really happy to hear that. And then Ariana, I feel like so much of your work has been around trying to spread the word about OER on the University of Houston campus. So I'm really interested in hearing your response to this.
Yeah, so I would say I don't think I was necessarily skeptical initially. I was more so in like extreme learning mode because I jumped into OER pretty brand new. So I was focused on catching up and gaining that baseline knowledge I knew I would need. But then if there was any sort of skepticism for me, it was whenever I felt there was kind of like a blanket statement or sentiment around open by default being better, or that everything should be open. And I may be exaggerating a little bit, and this may tie into what Becca was saying about not encountering very many skeptics in OER circles sometimes. So I don't think this, right, that sentiment, that blanket statement of OER is always better, I don't think that's very often the case, but it can maybe come across that way sometimes in conversations. And I know when I put my own content out there into the world, I want to think very carefully about whether to make it open, or what level of open and what license to use, and what am I comfortable with and what's appropriate for that type of content. And I also want to credit here some people who have really influenced my thinking around this, like Monica Brown and Cynthia Orozco. And I actually had an experience related to this recently where I was interviewed for an open project. And I really honestly wasn't sure if I wanted my interview to be openly licensed. And the interviewer and the person working on this project was really amazing in that sense. They sent me, after the interview, they sent me a transcript and a private recording of the interview so I could review it and take my time to make edits to the transcript. And they even gave me the opportunity for it to be anonymous. And I did not make it anonymous, and I did make it open. But that's the level of thought and care that can and should go into deciding whether or not to create open content. And in my role, I never want someone to feel like they're being pressured in that direction when they're not ready for it, or like they're being shamed for not going open. Because there are really valid reasons for being hesitant around it. So for someone who's skeptical, I would say it's okay to be skeptical. You know, this can be a very new idea, and for some people, like, takes time to wrap your head around, much less consider doing it yourself and then having the time and resources to do it. So I want to be there to answer people's questions honestly and provide the support I can along the way.
Wow, I hope that every institution has a librarian like you, Ariana. What a great response. And then before we get into the questions, I want to ask one last question to our panelists to sort of tie in this chat with the theme of the Michigan OER conference, as well as the title of this panel, which is Being the First. So now that you've been speaking for a long time about, you know, leading OER at your institutions, what would you say to someone who's the first at their institution? What organizations, communities, or practices would you recommend to people who are looking for a project to contribute to, or who have a project in mind but don't have collaborators or supporters at their school? So I'll go in reverse order, and Ariana, you can go first.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind for me is the Rebus community. So that I think of as like a crowdsourcing platform. If you're embarking on a project and want to find collaborators, or if you're just interested in contributing to something, you can find many people searching for collaborators there. So definitely check that out. I'm going to list like a few things. One sort of community or place to find other people that I find really helpful is the Spark OER listserv. I think I'm putting the right link in the chat. Yeah, there we go. And for me, sometimes what I do when I know I need an external perspective outside of just my own colleagues at my institution, I need to hear from someone who's really involved in OER work and learn from them. I've reached out to people just to kind of see if they're willing to chat with me, and I let them know, here's what I'm working on. Here are some questions I have for you, and whether they want to respond via email or set up a Zoom call, or if they don't have time for this right now at all because everyone's busy, then it's totally fine. But I found that people have been really generous with their time and wanting to share their experiences. So that's something that I found to be really helpful. As just in the OER work that we do, people are really great about just wanting to talk and share.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing those resources. Becca.
Sorry, sorry, I wasn't prepared.
No worries.
So I would definitely second the Rebus community, and I know that Apurva is in our meeting right now. We worked with, as part of our fellowship, we worked with the Rebus company to help, and they have a lot, and I have been contacted there since I'm in their platform. I've been contacted there multiple times to work with for advice, and also just to see what the status of my project was. And I mean, it's a great platform for that. And then I would recommend reaching out to ours is the Center for Teaching and Learning, because they probably have a lot of information, and they know of folks that are kind of like-minded, and there might even be projects on campus in other departments and colleges that you aren't aware of. That was definitely the case for me, that I was able to kind of find community there that wasn't necessarily in my department and not in my college at all. So that was very helpful for me.
Awesome. And hello to Apurva as well. Rebus is our sister organization, so we work closely with them, and they do some amazing work as a completely non-biased opinion. But Farhad, you can definitely take it away.
Sure, I echo everything Ariana and Becca have said. I think it's about finding the right ecosystem. And very often we're in our disciplinary ecosystem, and we go to those conferences and we have those colleagues and we read those journals. But there is an open education ecosystem that you need to find. And once you do, the resources are going to be so overwhelming to you in the good sense, and the like-minded people and the people at your institution that have been doing it, but you just didn't know. So, you just start anywhere. I mean, most of you, by the mere fact that you're at an open education conference today, you're already indicating that you're that kind of person, and I'm not worried about you, right? You're already just looking for a little bit more in depth, I think. Merlot is one of the open education resources that I've used. So, not the wine, but the website is in the chat. I just linked it. And they have a lot of curated materials across the board by international scholars. Every one of you will have a state or provincial organization that does this, and they will have resources for you. There's workshops, there's conferences, there's journals. So just find the ecosystem, enter it, and you will find so much support.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that resource as well. I will say that I love that you had touched on opening up the psychology department at KPU, and I really enjoyed that portion of your wonderful paper. And I'm I hope that everyone reads it. I have a link to it and I'll share it somewhere in the chat. So we have about 5 minutes left. Turns out discussions are longer than always imagined. I was hoping to save a little bit more time, but these were such excellent responses. I'm so happy that our panelists had a chance to answer all of them equally. Does anyone have any questions directly to our panelists? If you'd like to unmute and ask them. I will say there is a question that Kevin had asked about writing anything about the ways that open pedagogy and open resources have been or can be applied to study abroad programs. And I see that Becca had responded regarding her thoughts on this. Becca, if you wanted to elaborate, I'd be happy to listen to you talk about or answer this question in greater detail.
I mean, I think that this is a fantastic example of helping students to kind of make that decision to study abroad. Is if there aren't, I mean, I'm going to go first with costs, but quality. I found that when I was teaching as part of the study abroad program through my university, is that there weren't the resources there that I wanted to use, they weren't readily available for my students. So I felt like I needed to create something. And I guess I did this before I did my distinctive grammar. So I mean, I created something open so that my students could have those experiences that they might not have had at that study abroad university. So I mean, I feel like there's some interesting ways to kind of reach out to even universities at that visiting or professors at that visiting university that might be an interesting way to link universities together through around the world. As if you're happen to be sending students there, then why not have reach out to professors, or if you are going to be teaching abroad, which is always an opportunity, then to be able to work with those professors and create something common that will benefit students in the long run. And like I said in the chat, I would want students to help me create that in the future. I mean, that to me really is the next step for me in OER, is bringing students in to help better their educational experience, and creating, whether it be, a compilation or materials for the next group of students, or something to highlight their learning. That's where I want them to be involved.
What a great sentence to end our session on. That sort of summarizes so many people's, so many educators' desire to, implement OER into their classes and into all forms of learning. So thank you so much for that response. I think this is a good place to end the session. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and attendees. I love talking to people for this exact reason. Really helps me gain perspective on how I can do my job better, how we can open up the conversation between people from all over the world to talk about and discuss how we can all further open education. So thank you so much. Kelly, I'll hand it off back to you.
Okay, I just wanted to give everybody a big thank you for participating and attending, and very impressive early adopters and creators. Glad to have heard all of you speak today, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Great conversation.
Bye, Becca.